The banker who lent money to dead customers, Chicago's Phantom Credit Scandal, 1929. Harold Steinberg signed the loan documents with a steady hand, watching as his customer counted out exactly $2,847 in crisp bills across the mahogany desk of First National Bank of Chicago. The transaction appeared routine, except for one impossible detail. The borrower was Michael O'Connell, a steel worker who had died in a factory accident 3 weeks earlier. Harold had attended O'Connell's funeral himself, yet here sat the man in his office on October 15, 1929, requesting a business loan with documentation that included his own death certificate, burial receipt, and estate settlement papers. For 8 months, Harold had been processing similar loans to customers who were officially deceased, all of whom repaid their debts promptly and in full, often within days of borrowing. The phenomenon had begun the week after Harold was promoted to senior loan officer, when bank president Theodore Morrison assigned him to handle what Morrison called special circumstances lending for customers whose financial needs couldn't be addressed through conventional banking procedures. Harold had worked at First National Bank for 12 years, rising from junior clerk to senior loan officer through careful attention to detail and unwavering adherence to banking regulations. His reputation was built on conservative lending practices that minimized risk while serving the financial needs of Chicago's growing immigrant communities. But since accepting the special circumstances portfolio, Harold had been forced to abandon every principle of sound banking he had learned during his career. The Michael O'Connell case perfectly illustrated the impossible nature of Harold's new responsibilities. O'Connell had been crushed by falling steel beams at the Hawthorne Works on September 24, 1929. Harold had known the family personally. His wife Sarah had attended school with O'Connell's daughter, and Harold had contributed to the funeral expenses through the parish collection. Yet on October 15th, a man who looked exactly like Michael O'Connell walked into Harold's office, requesting a $3,000 loan to purchase equipment for a construction business. The man calling himself O'Connell provided all the documentation required for a business loan: incorporation papers, contractor's licenses, equipment purchase agreements, and financial projections that demonstrated the loan's viability. But he also provided documents that proved Michael O'Connell had died 3 weeks earlier: nearest death certificate signed by the coroner, burial permit from Holy Cross Cemetery, and probate court papers showing the distribution of his estate to surviving family members. When Harold questioned this apparent contradiction, the customer explained calmly that death was simply a temporary inconvenience that shouldn't interfere with sound business opportunities. He needed the loan to establish a construction company that would employ several other recently deceased steel workers, providing them with income opportunities that weren't available to dead people through conventional employment channels. Harold's training told him to reject the loan application immediately and possibly contact the police about what appeared to be identity fraud or grave robbing. But Theodore Morrison had given explicit instructions that special circumstances lending should accommodate unusual situations that didn't fit normal banking categories. Morrison had emphasized that First National's competitive advantage depended on serving customers that other banks couldn't or wouldn't help. Against his better judgment, Harold approved the O'Connell loan, filing the paperwork under the special circumstances category that Morrison had established for transactions that couldn't be documented through standard banking procedures. 3 days later, O'Connell returned to repay the entire loan with interest, providing payment in gold coins rather than the paper currency that had been borrowed. The O'Connell transaction followed the same pattern Harold had observed in dozens of similar cases over the previous 8 months. Dead customers would request loans for various business purposes, provide complete documentation proving both their death and their loan qualifications, receive the requested funds, and repay everything within a week using currency that was somehow different from what they had borrowed. But Harold's investigation into the special circumstances lending program revealed disturbing patterns that suggested something far more complex than simple fraud or mistaken identity. The dead customers weren't random individuals, they were all people who had died in industrial accidents, construction mishaps, or workplace incidents that involved companies with significant financial relationships to First National Bank. Moreover, the business ventures that dead customers claimed to be financing were all connected to industries where labor disputes, safety violations, or economic pressures were creating problems for First National's major corporate clients. The construction company that Michael O'Connell claimed to be starting would compete directly with firms that were facing strikes and work stoppages. The manufacturing cooperative that 3 dead foundry workers wanted to establish would provide alternative suppliers for companies dealing with production delays. Harold began to understand that special circumstances lending wasn't about serving dead customers. It was about using dead customers to solve business problems for living clients who paid substantial fees for First National's financial services. The dead borrowers were somehow being used to establish businesses that would compete with, replace, or undermine companies that were causing economic difficulties for the bank's major corporate accounts. Before I continue with Harold's discovery of what was really happening to Chicago's dead workers, I need to know you're prepared for this revelation. If you've ever suspected that your employer was asking you to participate in activities that weren't fully explained, write "I question authority" in the comments along with your city. Subscribe now, because what Harold uncovered about the phantom credit system will expose the most sophisticated labor exploitation scheme in American banking history. Harold's investigation into the true nature of special circumstances lending led him to examine the corporate loan portfolios that Theodore Morrison handled personally. These files revealed that First National's largest clients were all companies that had been experiencing significant labor problems since the beginning of 1929. Strikes, slowdowns, safety complaints, and worker organizing efforts that were reducing productivity and threatening profitability. The corporate files also contained correspondence between Morrison and company executives that discussed innovative solutions to labor management challenges. One letter from the president of Consolidated Steel specifically mentioned alternative workforce strategies that would allow production to continue despite worker resistance. Another document from Midwest Construction referenced specialized labor contracts that guaranteed project completion regardless of union interference. But the most revealing discovery was a series of financial reports that showed unusual patterns in the payment of corporate loans. Companies that were experiencing labor problems would suddenly make large payments to First National, immediately followed by the bank processing multiple special circumstances loans to dead individuals. The timing suggested that corporate clients were paying fees to access the services of deceased workers through the phantom credit system. Harold realized that First National Bank was operating as an intermediary in a supernatural labor market where dead workers were being employed to compete with living workers who were demanding better wages and working conditions. The special circumstances loans provided deceased individuals with capital to establish businesses that would undercut the economic leverage of living workers who were organizing for improved treatment. The mechanism was ingenious in its cruelty. Dead workers couldn't demand wages, benefits, or safety protections because they had no legal standing to negotiate employment contracts. They could perform labor without eating, sleeping, or requiring medical care, making them perfect strikebreakers who could maintain production indefinitely without incurring normal business expenses. Most importantly, they couldn't be injured or killed in workplace accidents because they were already dead. Harold's discovery of this supernatural strike-breaking operation led him to investigate the circumstances of the workplace deaths that had created First National's pool of deceased borrowers. Death certificates and accident reports revealed that most of the dead workers had died in incidents that could have been prevented through proper safety procedures and equipment maintenance. Michael O'Connell's death at the Hawthorne Works was typical. He had been crushed by steel beams that fell because of of defective support cables that the company had known were dangerous but hadn't replaced due to cost concerns. The foundry workers who died in a furnace explosion had repeatedly complained about faulty equipment that supervisors had ignored. The construction workers who died in building collapses had been forced to work with inadequate safety equipment to meet unrealistic deadlines. Harold began to understand that the workplace deaths weren't accidents at all. They were deliberate murders designed to create a workforce of dead employees who could be used to break strikes and undermine labor organizing efforts. Companies were allowing preventable workplace deaths to occur, then recruiting the victims for supernatural employment that would eliminate the labor problems that living workers created. But the phantom credit system was more sophisticated than simple supernatural strike breaking. The dead workers weren't just replacing living workers, they were being used to establish entire economic networks that operated outside normal labor law and business regulation. Dead-owned businesses couldn't be subject to workplace safety inspections, couldn't be unionized, and couldn't be held liable for injuries or deaths that occurred during their operations. This created a parallel economy where companies could outsource dangerous or controversial work to businesses owned by dead people who had no legal rights or protections. Environmental contamination, worker exploitation, and unsafe practices could be conducted through dead-owned enterprises that would disappear if authorities attempted to investigate or prosecute them. Harold's investigation revealed that Theodore Morrison had been developing the phantom credit system for over 2 years, working with corporate clients to identify workers whose deaths would be most useful for supernatural employment purposes. The bank president had been coordinating with company executives to ensure that specific individuals died in workplace accidents that would make them available for recruitment into the dead labor force. But Morrison's supernatural employment network wasn't limited to industrial workers. Harold discovered that the phantom credit system also included dead professionals whose expertise could be exploited without paying normal compensation. Dead lawyers could provide legal services without being subject to bar association oversight. Dead doctors could perform medical procedures without licensing requirements. Dead accountants could manipulate financial records without facing professional ethics sanctions. This explained why Morrison had promoted Harold to handle special circumstances lending. He needed a loan officer who was competent enough to process complex financial transactions but naive enough to not immediately recognize the criminal nature of the phantom credit system. Harold's reputation for conservative banking practices made him the perfect front for supernatural financial fraud. The realization that he had been unknowingly facilitating murder and supernatural slavery forced Harold to confront the extent of his own complicity in Morrison's criminal enterprise. Every special circumstances loan he had processed had supported businesses that were competing with living workers for employment opportunities. Harold had been helping to destroy the livelihoods of Chicago's working families while enriching corporate clients who were literally killing workers to improve their profit margins. But Harold also realized that exposing the phantom credit system would be extremely dangerous. Morrison and his corporate clients had already demonstrated their willingness to commit murder to advance their business interests. They wouldn't hesitate to kill a loan officer who threatened to reveal their supernatural employment operations. More problematically, Harold's evidence would be difficult for authorities to believe or act upon. The phantom credit system exploited the fact that supernatural activities weren't covered by existing laws or regulations. Even if police believed Harold's testimony about dead borrowers, they might not have legal authority to prosecute crimes that involved supernatural elements. Harold's dilemma became urgent when he discovered that his own name had been added to a list of potential candidates for workplace accidents that would make additional professional expertise available through the phantom credit system. Morrison was planning to have Harold killed in a way that would appear accidental, then recruit his ghost to continue processing supernatural loans without the inconvenience of a living conscience that might object to the bank's criminal activities. This discovery forced Harold to choose between attempting to expose a supernatural criminal network that might be impossible to prosecute, or fleeing Chicago to save his own life, while allowing the phantom credit system to continue killing workers and exploiting their deaths for corporate profit. The choice became more complex when Harold learned that the phantom credit system was connected to the stock market crash that occurred on October 24, 1929, just 9 days after he had processed the Michael O'Connell loan. The supernatural economic networks that Morrison had been developing had been designed to provide corporate clients with competitive advantages that would allow them to profit from the economic collapse that they had helped engineer. Dead-owned businesses had been established in every major industry, positioned to acquire assets and market share from companies that would fail during the economic crisis. The phantom credit system wasn't just about supernatural strike-breaking mission, it was about using murdered workers to consolidate economic power in the hands of corporations that had orchestrated the Great Depression for their own benefit. Harold realized that exposing Morrison's phantom credit system could potentially prevent some of the economic devastation that would otherwise result from the stock market crash. The dead-owned businesses that were positioned to benefit from the economic crisis could be disrupted if authorities understood how they operated and were willing to take action against supernatural economic manipulation. But Harold also understood that the corporate interests behind the phantom credit system had enough political and economic influence to protect themselves from prosecution even if their supernatural activities were exposed. The same companies that were willing to murder workers to create ghost employees would certainly be willing to murder government officials, judges, or journalists who threatened their operations. Harold's investigation had revealed that the phantom credit system was part of a much larger conspiracy involving major corporations, government officials, and financial institutions throughout the United States. The supernatural employment of dead workers was just one component of a comprehensive plan to concentrate economic power in the hands of a small group of corporate leaders who were willing to use any means necessary to achieve their goals. The final revelation came when Harold discovered that Theodore Morrison himself had died 6 months earlier and had been replaced by his own ghost, recruited through the same phantom credit system that he appeared to be operating. The bank president who had been coordinating supernatural employment operations was himself a murdered victim, whose ghost was being controlled by the same corporate interests that were exploiting other dead workers. This discovery meant that Harold wasn't just fighting against a corrupt bank president, he was fighting against a supernatural conspiracy that had already begun replacing living people in positions of authority with dead people who could be controlled more easily. The phantom credit system was a testing ground for supernatural methods of political and economic control that could eventually replace democratic institutions with corporate rule enforced through murdered and controlled ghosts. Harold's final decision was influenced by his realization that the phantom credit system represented an existential threat not just to individual workers, but to the fundamental nature of human society. If corporations could murder people and then exploit their ghosts for supernatural employment, there would be no limit to the atrocities they could commit in pursuit of profit and power. On October 30, 1929, Harold chose to expose the phantom credit system despite the personal risks involved. He gathered all of his evidence documenting supernatural lending practices, dead borrowers, and corporate connections, then contacted federal banking regulators and newspaper reporters simultaneously to ensure that the information would be made public even if he was killed before completing his investigation. The exposure of Chicago's phantom credit scandal created the largest financial investigation in American history up to that point. Federal agents raided First National Bank and dozens of related businesses, uncovering evidence of systematic murder, supernatural employment, and economic manipulation that reached into the highest levels of American business and government. But the investigation also revealed the limitations of legal systems that weren't designed to address supernatural crimes. Many of the dead workers who had been exploited through the phantom credit system couldn't be helped because their ghosts had been dispersed or destroyed when their supernatural employment contracts were terminated. The corporate executives who had ordered their murders often couldn't be prosecuted because the evidence of their crimes existed in supernatural forms that weren't admissible in conventional courts. The phantom credit scandal ultimately led to comprehensive reforms in banking regulation, workplace safety law, and corporate accountability that helped prevent some forms of worker exploitation and financial fraud. But it also demonstrated that technological and supernatural innovations could create new forms of crime and oppression that existing legal systems weren't equipped to address. Harold Steinberg survived the exposure of the phantom credit system and continued working in banking until his retirement in 1965. But he never forgot the lesson that the most dangerous criminal enterprises often hide behind facades of legitimate business activity, and that protecting society sometimes requires individuals to risk everything to expose truths that powerful interests want to keep hidden. The First National Bank of Chicago was closed permanently following the phantom credit investigation, and its assets were distributed to compensate families of workers who had been murdered to create the supernatural labor force. But several of the corporate clients who had used the phantom credit system to exploit dead workers continued operating under different names, suggesting that supernatural employment networks might have been re-established in other locations. Modern financial investigators studying the phantom credit scandal have found evidence that similar supernatural employment systems may have operated in other cities during the Great Depression, using murdered workers to maintain production and profits while living workers struggled with unemployment and economic hardship. The case remains a cautionary example of how economic crises can be exploited to implement forms of labor control that would be unthinkable during normal times. If this story has made you more aware of how financial institutions might be used to facilitate exploitation that goes far beyond conventional fraud, please share it with others who work in banking, finance, or regulatory oversight. Subscribe for more historical cases where individual employees discovered that their employers were using their professional expertise to commit crimes that violated the basic dignity of human life and death. Before you go, take a moment to consider, are there aspects of your work that you don't fully understand, or policies and procedures that seem designed to prevent you from asking certain questions? Harold Steinberg's experience with phantom credit reminds us that the most harmful criminal enterprises often depend on the cooperation of honest employees who don't realize they're being used to facilitate activities that violate their own moral principles. Remember, Harold's most important insight wasn't about banking procedures or supernatural phenomena. It was about the responsibility that comes with professional expertise. When you have specialized knowledge that allows you to detect patterns that others might miss, you also have an obligation to investigate those patterns even when doing so might threaten your career or personal safety. Next week we'll explore another case where someone's professional expertise allowed them to uncover a criminal network that was exploiting both living and dead victims for economic gain. Until then, remember that the most important questions aren't always about whether something is legal or profitable, but about whether it treats human beings with the dignity and respect they deserve both in life and in death.